It was buried between two tissues and a half-used lip balm, that small, folded receipt sitting inside her handbag like it belonged there. I hadn't been snooping. I was looking for the car keys she always misplaced. But the weight of that paper, even before I read it, felt wrong in my hand. It wasn't the number that hit me first. It was the date. 2 days after my father died. While I was finalizing burial arrangements and managing calls from relatives, she'd spent nearly $4,000 on a diamond necklace from the same account I had set aside, carefully, intentionally, for funeral costs. The digits were familiar because I'd labeled that transfer myself. Dad, final expenses. She never asked me, never mentioned it. Just assumed I wouldn't notice, or worse, wouldn't care. That was the moment the silence between us changed shape. And I started paying attention, quietly, precisely, not to the price of the necklace, but to the cost of pretending not to see. My name's Aaron. I'm 38, and I work as a mid-level accountant for a logistics firm that still uses fax machines more than email. It's not glamorous, but it's predictable. I like predictable. Routine has always been my anchor. Bills paid on the first, groceries every Sunday. Quarterly check-ins with my dad's doctor, budget spreadsheets that balance down to the last cent. There's a certain peace in knowing what the next day will bring, especially when the world outside never stops spinning. That's probably why I married Carla. We weren't some whirlwind romance. There was no dramatic proposal, no fireworks. We met through mutual friends at a company function. She liked that I was stable, employed, polite. I liked that she was efficient, organized, and not prone to drama. We didn't fall into love, we stepped into compatibility. It worked. We kept separate closets, ate dinner together most nights, split chores without arguments. She managed our social calendar, I handled our finances. It was clean, functional. I told myself passion fades anyway, and peace is better than heat that burns out. Over the years, I became the caregiver in our household, not for her, but for everyone else. When my father's health started slipping, I was the one driving him to appointments, managing his medications, fielding calls from his nurses. Carla didn't interfere, but she didn't offer either. Sod hospitals made her uncomfortable. I let it go. I'd always been the one smoothing the rough edges, assuming that's what being a husband meant. But slowly, something else took root. A dull ache I ignored, like walking with a stone in your shoe for so long you stop noticing. It wasn't until I saw that receipt that the stone shifted. All the excuses I'd made for her absence, her silence, her detachment, collapsed into something colder, something factual. It wasn't a marriage built on love or even friendship. It was a system. And somewhere along the way, only one of us was still participating. When my father passed, I didn't expect Carla to cry. That wasn't who she was, and I'd long stopped needing outward displays to measure someone's care. But I did expect her to show up, to be there, not just for me, for him. She knew how much he meant to me, how much time I'd spent managing his decline, how often I'd canceled plans to take him to appointments or stay overnight when the nurses said it was getting worse. She saw the hours I spent by his side. She saw the weight I carried. I thought that counted for something. The morning of the funeral, she told me she had a migraine. Said it started the night before, and she could barely stand. I asked if she was sure. She nodded, looking away. I left alone. Told myself it wasn't personal. At the service, people noticed. My aunts whispered, cousins exchanged glances. A few friends pulled me aside. "Where's Carla?" I gave them the line she gave me, said she was grieving differently. No one pushed further. They saw my face and let it be. Grief makes space for excuses. You let things slide because the alternative, confronting them, feels like another loss stacked on top of the one you're already carrying. The day passed in a blur, eulogies, dirt, consolations from people who hadn't spoken to my father in years but felt the need to say something anyway. When it was over, I went home and found Carla on the couch, scrolling through her phone, looking refreshed. She asked if everything had gone smoothly. I nodded, went to the bedroom and sat in silence. That moment should have stood out, but it didn't. It blended into the rest of the pattern. I'd been ignoring for years. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the lie unraveled. I'd logged into our shared account to confirm a cemetery invoice and noticed something odd, a withdrawal on the day of the funeral. Not one, several, jewelry boutique, fine dining, a luxury salon, all posted within 6 hours. All from the fund I'd labeled Dad, final expenses. I triple-checked, matched timestamps. Even verified the transaction location using our banking app. She wasn't home with a migraine. She was out spending money tied directly to my father's death. I sat there, staring at the numbers, hoping they'd change, hoping I'd misread something. But numbers don't lie. They don't explain either. They just sit there, cold and final. That was the moment things shifted, not in an explosive way. No shouting, no accusations, just a quiet click inside me, a recognition that something fundamental had broken. Not just trust, not just marriage, something deeper. The agreement we'd made silently to be on the same side of the table, that was gone. She didn't just skip the funeral. She took the opportunity, while I buried my father, to buy herself something shiny, something she could wear and pretend it meant nothing, but I knew what it cost. Not in dollars, in something far harder to earn back. I didn't bring it up. Not that night, not the next morning. There was no confrontation, no cold silence or passive-aggressive remarks. Just space, and the kind of stillness that doesn't announce itself but changes everything. I told myself I needed more clarity. That maybe there was some explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe it wasn't intentional. Maybe she hadn't realized which account she was using. But the truth is I wasn't buying that, not even then. What I needed wasn't a confession. I needed to see her clearly, without the excuses I'd been layering over her for years. So I watched. Nothing invasive, just careful attention. The way she checked her phone when I mentioned my father's name, how her voice flattened when relatives called to follow up on the burial plot. She never asked about the costs, never offered to help organize the final estate details. It was as if it was all behind her, like a canceled subscription. I stopped sharing updates, stopped giving her access to the accounts I once managed openly. I changed a few passwords, not because I thought she'd steal again, but because I didn't feel like explaining anything anymore. She didn't ask why. Didn't notice or pretended not to. That part hurt more than the receipt. I started cataloging things. Not in a spreadsheet, not yet, just in my mind. What she said, what she didn't say, where the credit alerts came from, who she called back and who she ignored. My grief, which had started as a dull ache, began reshaping itself into a sharper thing, still quiet, still buried, but more focused. Something had shifted in me, not out of anger, but out of clarity. And once that happens, you start seeing patterns you used to dismiss. You stop assuming people mean well just because you once needed them to. In the weeks that followed, I stopped moving emotionally and started moving numerically. There's something comforting about numbers. They don't ask for understanding. They don't try to justify themselves. They either add up or they don't. And in my case, they didn't. I pulled every joint statement from the past 6 months. Not because I was suspicious in a general sense. I needed to understand the structure of the breach, what had changed and when. The funeral fund was the tipping point, but something told me it wasn't isolated. People don't just flip one switch, they drift habitually, and I wanted to know how far she had drifted without me noticing. What started as a check on one account expanded into a full audit. Transaction logs, daily balances, transfers between sub-accounts. And then her card wallet, that's where it became clear, a pattern of cash transfers labeled emergency errands or shared expense moved silently into her personal credit line. Most were in small amounts, $80 here, $120 there, but they spiked around key moments. My father's hospitalization, the week I traveled for work, the final days before the funeral, always timed during moments of distraction on my end. 1. Charge stood out. A $3,800 jewelry purchase made 3 days before the funeral, not after. The receipt I'd found? That was just the final printout. The order was placed while my father was still in hospice. Drifting in and out of consciousness, the jewelry was registered under her name only. Not a gift, not a keepsake. A purchase made using a card linked to a fund I had clearly labeled and physically told her not to touch. There was no ambiguity here that shifted something inside me. This wasn't just selfishness or miscommunication. This was planning. Quiet, calculated planning. I spoke to someone at my bank, not to raise a dispute, but to understand the architecture of the accounts. Could someone argue joint ownership if the intent was documented otherwise? The advisor told me, if you can prove where the money came from and what it was earmarked for, it helps, but once it's in a shared pool, it gets murky. Murky, that word stuck with me, so I contacted someone who had no interest in murky answers, my father's estate attorney. I hadn't spoken to him since the week after Dad's death. When we went over the basics, property title, modest pension, and the funeral fund I'd personally topped up when Dad's own savings fell short, I asked him directly, if money was deposited into a shared account for a specific purpose, can misuse be challenged? He asked for receipts. Not just financial, digital, emotional, written intent. Luckily, I had more than enough. Emails to Carla reminding her not to touch the fund. Budget documents titled Dad Final Costs. A paper trail, tight and orderly, like everything else in my life, and suddenly I realized I'd been preparing for this without meaning to. The way I structured our finances, the folders, the file names, the date logs, I'd built a record of care, of responsibility that she hadn't counted on. It was subtle, the way she moved. Never enough to ring alarms, but always just enough to benefit herself while staying out of direct conflict. If I'd confronted her without the data, she would have called it paranoia. Said I was overthinking, that it was just money. But now I had more than a gut feeling. I had timelines. I had statements, I had intent. She didn't drain the account. She didn't bankrupt me. What she did was worse in its subtlety. She took something sacred, something meant for honoring, a man who taught me loyalty and restraint, and repurposed it for vanity. In secret, without apology. By the end of that week, I knew everything I needed to know. And quietly I began. Preparing not for a fight, but for a shift. A measured response. Built not on emotion, but on truth. A few weeks later, she wore the necklace to dinner. Not a special dinner, not an anniversary. Just one of those takeout nights where she felt like dressing up for no one in particular. She twirled the pendant between her fingers and caught my eye across the table. Do you like it? She asked almost playfully. It's real, she added, as if that made it more impressive. I nodded, said it looked elegant. Thanked her for keeping things light after everything with my dad. She smiled, satisfied, and returned to her glass of wine. I didn't flinch. Didn't ask questions. There was no performance in my silence. It was control, because by that point, I already had everything. The payment log tied to her personal credit card, the time-stamped withdrawal from our joint account, the surveillance stills from the store confirming who walked in and signed for the pickup, and even an email thread between her and the retailer confirming the appointment under her name. There was no missing piece. No room for doubt. The facts were intact. She just didn't know I had them. That gave me time to think clearly, not like someone wounded, but like someone calculating long-term safety. I started making structural changes, quietly. The joint savings were the first to go. I transferred the remaining funeral balance, what little hadn't been touched, to a private account with a new institution. Then I froze the shared account entirely, citing potential fraud. The bank didn't ask many questions once I showed them the flagged transactions and account notes. Next came my will. I'd drafted it after Dad got sick, simple, clean, straightforward. But now I needed revisions, a new executor, new clauses, a clear separation of marital property and personal inheritance. I worked with the estate lawyer over 2 weeks to update everything, making sure it held up under scrutiny. Then came the mediator, no attorneys yet. Just a neutral third party, someone who could see both sides of a marriage quietly splitting. Down the center and not rush to courtrooms and declarations. I booked the meeting under the pretense of financial restructuring, And when I told her about it, she barely blinked. She had no idea what was being protected or why. She assumed I was moving things around out of caution, maybe even grief. But this wasn't grief. It was clarity. This wasn't about punishing her. It wasn't about reclaiming money spent. That necklace was gone, and so was whatever was left of trust. What mattered now was protecting the legacy my father left, not in assets, but in the values he instilled in me. Quiet strength. Clean lines, no drama, just decisions. Revenge never crossed my mind. But boundaries? Those became non-negotiable. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I just wasn't going to let her touch anything sacred again. A few weeks passed. Nothing explosive had happened between us, just quiet days and cooler dinners. I gave her space to feel comfortable again, to believe things were settling. Let her wear the necklace around the house, out to dinner, even to a friend's baby. Shower. She never once asked where our finances stood. Never noticed the absence of certain accounts or the lack of notifications on shared platforms. That told me everything I needed to know about what she'd valued in the first place. Then one afternoon, I casually brought it up over lunch. I was thinking, I said, between sips of coffee, we should get the necklace appraised, just to insure it properly. She blinked, then lit up. Said she'd been meaning to get it certified anyway. It's real, of course, she smiled, adjusting the clasp on her neck like it had just become a family heirloom. But yeah, let's do it. I made the appointment. For a Thursday afternoon, 3 p.m., the same store she bought it from, same floor manager. I called ahead and confirmed everything. They remembered me, or more accurately, they remembered the paper trail we walked in together. She wore the necklace, hair swept up, makeup done like she was presenting a prize. I kept things neutral, polite but brief. No tension, no clues. The moment we approached the counter, the store clerk's face shifted. Recognition followed by a flicker of hesitation. You're the one who called about the disputed transaction, right? He said loud enough for her to hear. She froze. I didn't answer. Just looked at her and then back at him. Yes, I said calmly. We're here for the appraisal. The silence behind me felt like a dropped curtain. She didn't speak. Didn't fidget. Just stood there, hands suddenly unsure of where to rest. I pulled out a small folder from my coat pocket. Inside were printed bank statements, itemized transactions, date-matched transfers from the funeral fund, all highlighted. All sourced. At the front of the stack, the original transfer receipt labeled Dad, Final Expenses. I placed it on the counter. Turned it gently so it faced her. She picked it up like it might sting. You used money set aside for my father's burial too. Buy this, I said, quietly. Her voice, when it came, was low and defensive. It was from our joint account. That makes it ours. I shook my head. Not anymore. She looked at the statements again, then at me, then back at the clerk, who had stepped away. Sensing the air shift, she wanted to fight. I could see. It built behind her eyes. But there was no ground left. No lies that would hold. Every detail was documented. Every action she took had a trail. So she didn't scream, didn't plead. She just stood there, quietly scanning for a door. When we walked out of the store, she didn't speak. Not on the drive home, not when we stepped into the house. That night, she packed a few bags. Didn't ask where things stood legally. Didn't ask if she could stay. She knew there's a different kind of confrontation that doesn't need raised voices or slammed doors. Just facts, just timing. Just enough silence for someone to see themselves without your help. She left before midnight. Didn't say goodbye. Just left the necklace on the kitchen table, still in the box. Still pretending it was worth something. 3 months later, it was finalized. No drawn-out hearings, no dramatic courtroom tension. Just 2 signatures, a few notarized documents, and the quiet legal end to something that had already died months earlier. Carla didn't contest the divorce. She didn't challenge the separation of assets, probably because she couldn't. Every relevant account, email, and fund transfer had been documented, time-stamped, and cross-referenced. The estate lawyer handed it to the court like a ledger, clean, irrefutable. The remaining funds from my father's estate were awarded to me in full. Not because I fought for them, but because no one else could lay claim. Carla hadn't left. A paper trail that supported her entitlement. Only a trail of self-interest and silence. I moved out of the house 2 weeks after the paperwork was stamped. Back to my father's old apartment. It was smaller, older, and filled with echoes of his voice. But it felt solid, honest, like walking into a space that didn't require you to pretend. Carla and I didn't speak after that. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she sold the necklace online, listed it on some secondhand luxury site. It sold for half its value, less, if you account for the platform's fees. I remember wondering if she felt anything when she packed it up. Regret, maybe. Or just annoyance that it didn't sell for more. There's something strange about watching someone reduce a moment of betrayal into a resale listing, like it never carried weight. Like it was just another object to offload when it no longer served a purpose, but some things can't be returned. Not for value, not for meaning. Trust, once fractured like that, doesn't rebuild. It calcifies. Becomes a memory you stop trying to reshape into something more forgivable. What hurt the most wasn't the money, or even the deception. It was the ease of it. The quiet, calculated way she assumed I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I would notice and still do nothing. That's what betrayal really is. Not the act itself, but the belief that the person on the other end doesn't matter enough to be careful with. I don't share this story for sympathy. I'm not interested in painting myself as a victim. I'm fine now. Actually, I'm more than fine. There's a peace in knowing exactly where you stand, even if that clarity comes with loss. I share it because betrayal doesn't always come from your enemies. It often comes from the people closest to you, the ones who share your meals, your passwords, your bed. The ones who assume your silence is weakness, not precision. But I wasn't silent because I was unaware. I was watching, quietly, intentionally, and when it mattered. I moved. So if you've ever felt that something wasn't quite right but couldn't yet prove it, trust yourself. Trust the silence inside you that's paying attention. Not every battle requires noise. Sometimes the most lasting accountability is delivered without a raised voice. Sometimes all you need to say is nothing, and still be heard.